So I'm going to start off. I've never introduced myself before, but I'm Rick Miller, Oregon State University, and I'm starting my fifth decade, even though I'm a emeritus, so 41 years at OSU. And it's just been, like Bruce Roundy said when he received his award, it's been a good ride the whole way. Okay, well, to start off, I'm going to talk about changes that have occurred and in the woodlands, which we're all very much aware of and we've heard a lot about. And some of you have probably kind of heard some of this story before, but I've been working on a PJ book and wading through hundreds of pieces of literature that have been written on pinyon juniper woodlands. And I have over 1,000 references, so I still have a way to go. But what I'm finding is that it kind of puts things into context and gives me a better understanding for the whole region, because I think what happens to a lot of us, including myself, is we tend to get some of our own regional biases. The woodlands have definitely been changing, and I know when we talk about going into looking at the past, I had a student one time ask me, well, why do we want to know about the past, when we really should be focusing on the future? And my response is that when we have some feel for how, when we have climate changes of going cool, wet, or wet, dry, and how does that link with fire, and getting a handle on how does vegetation respond to that, gives us some insight of how we got to where we are today and where we might be going in the future. There's very few people that would argue we've had dramatic climate change, and probably our largest shift came from full glaciation, which was about 20,000 years ago, to about the middle of the Holocene maximum, which is around 4,000 to 7,000 years ago. And that's when we had the largest change and shift in vegetation. But what's surprising is that many of the species we have today were present on the landscape back during that time period. And if we were to take a look, this would be up in more the northwestern part of the Great Basin, and you can see out towards the cursor here. This area out here would be Wyoming big sagebrush, very arid, very dry. You can see the old scar of a Pleistocene lake, ancient Chihuacan. And then up here, this is Winter Rim, considerably higher, mixed conifer, but on the drier aspects and lower elevations, you have pinyon juniper. Peter Wiegand, who's a really well-known paleobotanist, put this image together to overlap that this is probably what this landscape looked like, would have been during glacial max. And what's interesting is it would have been a treeless landscape, at least in the northwestern part of the basin. And out in this area where the pollen record shows that you had serviceberry, you had snowbrush, and likely there was also sagebrush was the dominant, and it's very difficult to separate out the pollen of the subspecies, but it was likely mountain big sage back then. And there was juniper, but we had Juniperus communis and horizontalis, the two low shrubby junipers that grow in much wetter sites. So it was a very different climate. There were some species that migrated long distances, and if you look at the circled M's are Monophylla single needle pinyon. Of course, we have E for edulis, which is the two needle. The F is kind of a hybrid or subspecies. There's debate, but probably it's a offspring of edulis. And you can see during full glacial max how far south it was depressed. And then it migrated pretty long distances to where the present distribution is today. And what's interesting is right along the Nevada and Utah border is where it was it moved very quickly. It was up to its almost northern range well before Monophylla actually dumped over from the Owens Valley into the Great Basin. If we were to consider Utah juniper more on its eastern part of the range, Utah juniper farthest north was at the mouth of the Green River where it dumped into the Colorado River. And then you can see the arrow there up north where its present northern range is today. But over in Nevada, on its western part of the range, it's really was almost at its northern limit. It hasn't moved or up north or south, but it was moving up and down in elevation to adjust to temperature and different moisture regimes. Western juniper doesn't show up until about 8,000 years ago, 8 to 9,000 years ago, is on the western shores of Winnemucca Lake, and there's no evidence of western juniper in the Great Basin prior to that time. And I've talked to Robin Tausch and Peter Wiegand, and the three of us have really talked a lot about this, and we all agree that it most likely was over in the Sacramento Valley on the other side. And one thing that would support that is there are some patches of juniper over there that are very pure genetically strains of Western juniper that doesn't have a bit of a mix of Utah juniper in with that. The expansion, if you move down farther south, pretty much where pinyon juniper woodlands are today would have been limber pine and bristlecone pine. It moved up and down slope, 1,000 to 3,000 feet in elevation. But the interesting thing is that during cool, moist periods, these woodlands expanded, not only moving, but they expanded, and it was during the warm, dry periods where we had these contractions. And it was during this transition period where you have the maximum amount of ash and large charcoal. So when you had these long, moist, cool periods, moving into these dry, warm periods is when we had a maximum amount of fire that also interacted with drought and contraction of these stands. And of course, during glacial max, the cold would restrict movement. But if we look, then come down to the last 1,000 years, coming out of neoglacial, during the neoglacial period, which was, we're in the Holocene now, was a relatively cool, wet period, was when Peter Wiegand, Meringer, and a lot of these paleobotany guys talk about there being the maximum amount of juniper and pinyon on the landscape prior to 1850. So they kind of call this the woodland max. But then we went into this warm period, a medieval warm period. Fire right there is that transition, contraction, reduction, and then we move into the little ice age right up to about the time of Eurasian settlement. And there was a slow increase in PJ, was starting to move and expand during that time period, but it was a slow move. So if we take a look at what woodlands we have, these old growth woodlands today, kind of look at structure, there's a few things we can learn that we do know. A lot of them tend to be on these shallower soils up on the ridge tops, but we do have some that are considerably more dense and occur on some of these deeper soils. But the thing that's interesting, and it's supported by a lot of good, strong data, is that many of these woodlands pre-1850 were more open. And what supports that, if you go way back, a lot of the pollen data, well, particularly the macrofossil pack rat, shows that there were pretty decent understories in a lot of these woodlands across this landscape. But if you look at the chronology data, many of these persistent woodlands, even those that had very little fire, and where we don't think really had that much impact by anthropogenic, we've had infill. So there's been a significant increase in many of these woodlands in density that were more our old persistent woodlands, where they've become more closed. This is a woodland up in Western juniper woodland. That's one of the few that I've come across where there's been very little impact and disturbance. It's got a really nice component of bunch grasses, sagebrush in the understory, relatively open. There's been some infill in this woodland, but it's still relatively open. What role fire played during this time? I mentioned the transition, but topography played a big role too with fire, where we had, you can look at this landscape, which is down not that far from where we are now, and you can see how the concave areas, which would have had our deeper soils, would have had the higher fuels, are either open in sagebrush or they're being filled in, but oftentimes those are where you're going to have your younger trees, and your older trees will be more up here where you can see those areas. Like right in this area here would have quite shallow soils. And Andrew Nicole back in the 20s and 30s has a great state quote in one of his publications that talks about the encroachment and movement of young trees into the grasslands, and this is in Arizona, and the old seed trees up on the rocky knolls. A really good image, unfortunately, this is out of Barney and Frischneck, a real classic 1974 paper. But this really shows that how the topography has played a real role. And all that open country you see is a big giant fire scar. And it just kind of burned through those concave areas. And then you get the shallower soil ridge areas where you've got the PJ type. The other thing is, and Dave Board's going to talk more about this later today, is that fire is very regional. And this is where I think some of us get the regional bias. If you work in the Colorado Plateau and you hear Rick Miller working up here in the Northwest, and I'm saying, boy, fire is a major component, and you work down in, if I can get the cursor right, down in this country, you think, what do you mean? Well, fire's not that big of a component. That guy, he's a pyromaniac and he doesn't know what he's talking about. But you can see there's a real pattern and how it can bring your bias. And what's interesting is part of this is recent. So some of this definitely is driven by the increase in annuals. So that's going to be exaggerating this difference. But you go from northern Nevada pulling north, and you definitely are picking up, you're getting more fuel on the ground, more productive sites, but you're also getting a lot of lightning strikes in July and August when we get very little moisture. You move down, as you can see, the gradient, and you're moving south, and you're going to be getting more lightning strikes with precip and lower fuel loading. So, okay, what happened then? 1850 to present. Well, there is some debate. I think most people say, okay, yeah, there's either been a lot of expansion to some people say, well, yeah, there's been a little bit of expansion, but a lot of this stuff has been around a long time. So there's some debate on the magnitude. And the causes, climate, fire, grazing, CO2 are often the ones thrown around, maybe a combination or a single, and we're going to take a quick look at those. If we take a look at what evidence we have, if we take a look at it from the paleobotany standpoint, Cole, who did that neat map of the migrations, opinion, and juniper, you can see that Cole has a statement that the previous changes that occurred during the Holocene period, neoglacial to medieval, that they were pretty minor compared to the changes that we've seen in the last 200 years. Meringer, who's done a lot of macrofossil work and a lot of pollen core work, says that pollen from juniper has increased fivefold since the 1800s. If we look at the inventory work that's been done by O'Brien and Wittenberg, you can see their estimates of, with their inventory in Nevada and Utah, what percent of these stands they felt were young stands and what percent were old stands. Now, there's no doubt some people say, well, there are a lot of country that was cut and harvested for particularly pinyon for charcoal, and up to maybe estimates as high as 700 to 800,000 acres, but that's only about 3.5% of the total acreage of PJ, so it's a small amount when you take a look at the big picture. Bolsinger did an inventory, and what's interesting, and I think the chronology would show this, is you go from where we are today or farther south and kind of work a transect going farther north and west, that the proportion of young woodlands seem to increase. Gedney's work in Oregon and a lot of our tree coring work in Oregon and Idaho would fit more Bolsinger's estimate in terms of the proportion of young to old. The chronology work, there's about 24 studies in chronology. A lot of them, unfortunately, are not published. But the chronology work shows two things. One is that we did have a lot of old stands, but we also have a lot of young stands, and that there has been this huge increase where we've seen infill in the old stands. And that's what's interesting and where it gets confusing. I'm kind of the proponent of, we've seen this decline in fire, and so that's been a major player. Nicole did some really great work down on No Man's Mesa and Deer Mesa in areas that have had very little grazing, very little evidence of fire, but we've seen this surge of trees. And we've seen the same thing up in some of our real scabby low sage sites that really fire, there was never enough fuel on the ground where fire was a major player, and we've seen this increase in the last 150 years. So what I did here is, this is just kind of a mock-up of a tree chronology that if I took about 3/4 of the tree chronologies, they would follow this general pattern, including Nicole's work here on Deer Mesa, which shows kind of this general increase, a slow increase during the pre-settlement period. And then you have, well, I won't get ahead of myself. So here, this is just kind of the general pattern. And just to show you one of the works, this is Biondi and Bradley's work done just across the border over in Nevada, south of Ely. As you can see, kind of a young stand and an older stand, but you see this big spike that occurs in the early 1900s. You see kind of a gradual increase that's occurring pre-settlement, and then kind of a taper off. And I would say about 3/4 of the dendrochronology work would show this general pattern. So what's going on here? Well, we're in the Little Ice Age. We had this medieval, very dry period. The Little Ice Age was cold. There's some controversy. I think most people agree it was wet at least at the initial part of the Little Ice Age, but it might have been drier, and it kind of depends on maybe where you were in the landscape. Livestock come on the scene. There's some pretty good debate and argument, but I think evidence that livestock come on the scene, we see a dramatic drop in fire because we're getting a reduction of fine fuels. Also, aboriginal burning was pretty well shut down. We see this an increase in acceleration of trees coming in at that time, but then look at that spike we get in the 1900s. Woodhouse showed that they looked at 100 weather stations from Canada down to Mexico, and they found and these were weather stations that had records from the late 1800s to present, show this persistent wet period from 05 to 1917, and then we're kind of going into a warmer, drier phase right now. So that pluvial period would have been a couple things. One, it meant that we had good growing conditions for cone production, seedling establishment, but we would have also had good conditions for fuel buildup and fire. And we've seen in the last couple decades where our big regional fires occur in years that usually follow wet years because we get this accumulation of fine fuels in the landscape. And that's when we get our large fires. So those would be important in these areas that are kind of marginal for fuel load. And then you get these wet years, we get these fires. So we likely would have seen more fire during that time period. But on one end of the scale, you do have sites that are fairly productive and aren't as in the need that wet period, and those sites tended to burn more frequently. But what we're seeing today, a lot of what we're seeing today with this big kind of explosion of junipers, this pluvial surge that occurred in the 1900s with that combination of components, and not only in areas that have been impacted by, say, fuel loads have changed, but also areas where we're seeing infill during that time of areas that really saw very little fire. So Wigan made a comment that this kind of moving in from that wet pluvial period of the 1900s, kind of coming in, that the contradiction is the paleo work would say, well, in the 40s and 50s, we should have seen a lot of fire and a lot of charcoal in the landscape and then a contraction. But it didn't happen. But the question is it happening today? Where suddenly we are starting to see, and Dave Board will talk a little bit about the trend of seeing increasing large fires. And it could be this annual grasses component, CO2. What CO2 does is it makes the trees more water efficient, so you can have denser canopies in these stands. You can have a higher leaf area, denser compact, which means increased fuel in that canopy layer. But also, I think, more erratic weather, where we get some wet years and then we go into some dry years. And you go in these wet cycles, this is where I think we're going to be seeing probably a higher frequency of these larger fires. So Henry Wright, who kind of for a lot of us was considered the father of fire on rangelands, made this comment that to precede that, he mentioned, climate is a major driver in vegetation and response, but he says you still cannot separate the effects of climate with fire or grazing. And so just to kind of wrap it up here, I think what we need to realize is that many of these woodlands have been here for, in some areas, thousands of years, in some areas, tens of thousands, and even well over 100,000 years. And they've always been dynamic, but we've seen kind of an unprecedented expansion of these woodlands in the last couple hundred years, and we've got some new players of altered fire regimes, CO2, and particularly our annual grasses. So.